Okay, good morning, sixth graders. Today we are going to be looking over the properties of multiplication and addition, or in the order of operation. So there's a couple different options of the ways you can take your notes. So if you want to take a more concise notes on the grouping symbols and order of operations and just write down examples of the properties, you can do so down here. But I would highly suggest writing down the definitions of the properties and the examples for you to look back at. So if you want to pause the video now and write down the definitions of the properties, you can do so. And then we will get started on going over them. So the properties of addition and multiplication are very similar, but there's always a few distinct little differences. So we're starting off today with the associative property. The associative property says when three or more numbers are multiplied or added, the sum or product is the same regardless of the grouping. So the associative property is all about grouping. So I like to think of it as the associate and who you associate with. So we take A times B times C in our grouping symbols is equal to the same as grouping A times B times C. Or A plus grouped B plus C is equal to A plus B plus C. So remember, if we think about the order of operations, we always do what's in our parentheses first. So we would do A times B, or B times C first times A. And here we would do B times A first times C. So what we need to do is think about how they are grouped or how they are associating with each other. First here, B and C are associating with each other. Then A and B is associated with each other. And we take A plus B plus C, and here, in A plus B here. So the associative is all about how items are grouped. Then we go to the commutative property, which says when two or more numbers are multiplied, the product is the same regardless of the order, or the sum is the same regardless of the order. So the commutative property is all about order. So it's all about the order in which we add. So I like to think of the commutative property, and I like to think commute. So we always go get the same distance, but we just go in a different order. So we have A times B is equal to B times A, or A plus B is equal to B plus A. So think about it. If you're going to school or coming home from school, you're traveling the same distance, but you're headed in a different direction. So that is the commutative property, the commute. So it doesn't matter the order, you're still going to get the same answer when you're adding or multiplying. Then we have the distributive property. The distributive property is the only property that combines the two operations. So we've used this a little bit this year, but we're really going to dive into it deeper in a few coming up lessons. But let's look at it. The distributive property says the sum of two numbers times the third number is equal to the sum of each added in times the third. So we have A times B plus C is equal to A times B plus A times C. So it's saying that we can take that A and we can distribute it to both the B and the C and multiply them before we add them. So let's look at this with a real number situation. So let's do 3 times 4 plus 5 would be the same as 3 times 4 plus 3 times 5. So let's use the order of operations to solve both of these. So first we do what's in the parentheses. So we do 4 plus 5, which is 9. So then we have 3 times 9, which is 27. Let's check to see if it equals. 3 times 4 is 12, plus 3 times 5 is 15. So then we have 12 plus 15 is 27. So it does work. We have both answers equal 27. So we get, no matter if we distribute or if we follow just the order of operations, we get the same answer. The distributive property comes in handy when we're solving equations and when we are working with big numbers that we can split up into smaller numbers. Now we go into properties that look a little different for both the multiplication and identity, for both multiplication and addition. So these are going to look a little different, but they have the same ideas. So the first one we're going to look at is the identity property. And the identity property says the product of any number and 1 is that number. So any number times 1 equals that number. So that's its identity. And for addition, it's the sum of any number and 0 is the original number. So any number plus 0 equals that number. That number is its identity. Then for our inverse property, we take the product of a number and the inverse of that number is 1. So any number times its inverse or its reciprocal, so 1 over A equals 1. So if we multiply that out, that would be A times 1 is A, so A over A equals 1. For the additive inverse, it says the sum of the number and the opposite of the number is 0. So our number plus its opposite, which would be its negative, or its opposite, if it was negative, it would be its positive, would be 0. So let's look at that. It's like 5 plus negative 5, which equals 0. So those are our properties of multiplication and addition. They are what we use to help us simplify and solve equations in math. So they will become in handy in our next chapter. And we will be using them today to practice identifying them. So let's now move into our order of operations, which we can remember using Gemma's, Pemmida's, or please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. But what we need to do, what you might see that's a little different here, is grouping symbols, because grouping symbols are not just parentheses. You will see some different types of grouping symbols other than just parentheses. So when we're working with order of operations, our first step is always to simplify anything inside of grouping symbols. So that's always our first step. So some different grouping symbols you might see are parentheses, brackets, or you might even see some braces when you're working with expressions and equations. So let's look at an example expression. So we have 10 plus 3 squared plus parentheses 4 minus 2 times 5. So our first step is always going to be what's inside these parentheses here. So 4 minus 2 is 2. When we are working on simplifying expressions and equations, remember we always work down our page. So we put our answer right below, then we drop down the rest of our expression. And we're going to drop it down into our next example as well. So our second step, so our first step is grouping symbols, our second step is exponents. So after we have all of our grouping symbols eliminated, we simplify any term that has an exponent. So in our example here, it would be 3 squared. So that's 3 to the power of 2, or 3 times 3, which is 9. So I'm going to write my answer right below, and I'm going to drop down the rest of my expression. And I'll drop it, since there's no more exponents, down into the next example. And what we have to remember for our next two steps is that these two operations happen at the same time. But what is extremely important is we remember that we work from left to right. So we multiply and divide at the same time, working from left to right. So just like you read, you work from left to right. So in our example, we only have multiplication, so we really don't have to worry about it. So our only step would be then to multiply 2 times 5, which is 10. Then we drop down the rest of our expression. Since we have no more multiplication or division, I'm going to drop down this expression into my next example. And what we have to remember again is that we add and subtract at the same time, working from left to right. So I work and I start out here on my left side. So I have 10 plus 9 is 19. I drop down the rest of my expression. Now I have 19 plus 10, which is 29. So my simplified expression equals 29. So now let's look at that last page. So up here on the top of your notes, you can do a little summary for yourself if you want to of the steps of order operation and give yourself another example of the properties, or if you used that earlier in your notes, then that's fine. What I really want to look at on this page is the practice part where we're practicing identifying the properties. So let's look over these and practice them. So the sum of any number and 0 is that original number. So our key words here are sum and 0. So what we need to think about is which property talks about having the sum of any number and 0 is the original number. The answer would be the additive inverse. Is any number and the sum of 0 and any number gives us that original, not inverse, sorry you guys. Additive identity gives us that original number. Let's look at number 2. The sum, once again, or adding 0 to any number leaves it unchanged. So once again, we have adding and 0. What would our property be? Once again, it is our additive identity. And number 3, the sum of a number and its opposite is 0. So let's look. What are our key words? We have sum and we have opposite. So that's going to give us our additive inverse. Number 4, the order in which two numbers are multiplied does not affect the product. So we have ordered and multiplied. So which property is grouped with order? So order is commutative. And since we're multiplying, or we have our of multiplication. So the commutative property of multiplication. When 3 or more numbers are added, the way they are grouped does not affect the sum. So our key words are added and grouped. So which property has to do with grouping? It is our associative. And it's adding, so the associative of addition. And number 6, the product of any number and its inverse is 1. So we have product and inverse. So which property has to do with product and inverse? That would be the multiplicative inverse. So those are the two main things that you're going to be working on today, is identifying properties and simplifying expressions using the order of operations.